I've always loved the stillness of late-night walks. Something about the cool air and the quiet world makes everything feel simpler. I've been a welder for over 40 years now. Just me and my dog, Cooper, living alone on a farm too big for one man. I never had the heart to sell it after my wife, Helen, passed. The house, the land, it's all I have left of her. My kids moved away years ago, and ever since cancer took Helen, it's just been me and Cooper. One night, after a long day in the shop, I set out for my usual walk around the property. The air was crisp, and Cooper trotted beside me, his ears perked up like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I'd walked this loop 100 times, but as I neared the house, something caught my eye. My gaze drifted up to the second-story bedroom window, the room Helen and I used to share. For a split second, I saw movement. I stopped cold, staring up at the window. There shouldn't have been anyone in there. I hadn't set foot in that room in years. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My blood boiled at the idea of a trespasser in my home. I ran inside, heart pounding, and took the stairs 2 at a time. When I threw open the bedroom door, I found nothing. The room was exactly as I had left it, untouched, frozen in time. I checked every inch, but there was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance. I felt foolish. Maybe it had just been my imagination. But as I stood in that empty room, the feeling that something had been there lingered. The next night, I woke up to Cooper, growling, low, guttural, and unrelenting. My dog never barked without reason. I sat up, listening. That's when I heard it, soft creaking coming from upstairs. My stomach twisted. It could have been the old house settling, but my mind went straight to footsteps. Footsteps in Helen's old room. I hesitated. Should I grab my hunting rifle? No, I didn't want to overreact, but I was sure as hell not going to sit there and wait. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs slowly. When I reached the bedroom, I found the same empty space, the same undisturbed furniture. But something was different. The air in the room felt heavy, almost charged. It was as if the walls held their breath, waiting. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, my pulse drumming in my ears. Then a noise, a whisper, a breath. I couldn't be sure, but it made my skin crawl. The next night I came downstairs to find the kitchen lights on. I knew I had turned them off before bed. I never left lights on. My hands were shaking when I picked up the phone to call the police. They arrived quickly, searched the entire house, and found nothing. They were polite, but dismissive. Told me to call again if I needed them. But I could tell. They thought I was just an old man spooked by the dark. Then came the worst night of all. I couldn't sleep, so I forced myself to go upstairs again, thinking maybe if I faced it head on, I'd feel better. But when I opened the bedroom door, my heart nearly stopped. Helen's clothes I had packed away after she died, were strewn across the floor. I stood frozen. This wasn't something I could explain away. This was real. And then in the doorway, I saw her. A woman. She wasn't Helen. Too short, too gaunt. I couldn't see her face clearly, but she was just standing there watching me. My fear turned into pure instinct. I lunged at her. She turned and bolted, flying down the stairs and out the front door. By the time I made it outside, she was gone. Cooper barked wildly, nose to the ground, but there was no trace of her. That night changed everything. For months, I barely slept. Every sound in the house made my skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. I started keeping my rifle beside the bed, convinced that one night I'd have to use it. And then I saw her again. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the television without really watching. when a movement outside caught my eye. I turned slowly toward the window, and there she was, standing in the yard, just standing there, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside, Cooper close on my heels. I fired a few warning shots into the air, hoping to scare her off. She didn't move at first, just stood there, a dark silhouette in the moonlight. Then finally, she turned and ran, vanishing into the trees. I stayed outside for hours, my rifle still clutched in my hands, watching the tree line, waiting for any sign of movement. But the night remained still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums, filling the silence with imagined whispers. That was weeks ago. I haven't seen her since, but I know it's only a matter of time. The house doesn't feel like mine anymore. It feels like something else is living here. Something unseen, something watching. Every so often I'll catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping just out of sight. And the worst part, I don't think it's just her anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from the upstairs room. Not just one voice, but several. Low, murmuring, almost like a conversation I'm not meant to hear. I try to convince myself it's the wind, but deep down, I know better. I don't know who she is or why she chose my house. Maybe she's just some drifter, a lost soul with nowhere to go. Maybe there's something more sinister at play. But one thing is for sure, I can't live like this forever. Thank God for Cooper. I have no idea what I'd do without him. I'll send an update if anything happens. I work for a catering service, which means I spend most of my nights driving across town, delivering food to high-end events. It's not the worst job, but the hours are brutal. By the time I get home, I'm either so wired from caffeine that I can't sleep, or I crash the second my head hits the pillow. That night was no different. It was just past 2 a.m. when I finally finished my last delivery and started heading home. As I neared my apartment, I realized I had downed way too many energy drinks. My pulse was racing, and there was no way I'd be able to sleep anytime soon. Worse, I hadn't eaten in hours, and my stomach was making it very clear that it wasn't happy about it. There was a 24-hour burger joint off the highway, about 10 minutes from my place. My usual go-to for a late-night snack. It wasn't anything fancy, but something about those greasy fries always hit the spot. I pulled into the drive-thru, surprised to see a handful of cars ahead of me. This place was usually dead at this hour. As I waited, I found myself absent-mindedly scanning the parking lot. That's when I noticed it. A beat-up Volkswagen sat in the farthest corner of the lot, its windows completely blacked out. The restaurant's lobby was closed, so there was no reason for a car to be parked there. Employees had their own section on the opposite side, so it couldn't have been one of them. Maybe someone eating in their car. I did that sometimes too, but something about this car felt off. I tried to shake the unease as I grabbed my food and drove off. I wasn't ready to go home yet, so I decided to eat somewhere with a view. There was a scenic overlook about 15 minutes away, a place I used to go with friends back in high school. It sat on top of a hill, offering an unobstructed view of the entire city. It had been years since I'd been there, and tonight seemed like the perfect time for a nostalgia trip. When I arrived, the lot was empty, just as I expected. I pulled in, cut the engine, and was about to take my first bite when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Another car was pulling in. It was the Volkswagen. Every hair on my body stood on end. It had to be a coincidence, right? But what were the odds? Maybe they were just here to enjoy the view, like me. Maybe I was being paranoid. The car rolled to a stop a few spaces away. I watched in my mirror, waiting for someone to step out. No one did. The engine shut off, but the car just sat there, motionless. My gut screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to be paranoid over nothing. Instead, I grabbed my phone and FaceTimed my best friend, Chris. He lived about 5 minutes away. If he picked up, I'd invite him to hang out. If not, I'd eat my food and leave. Chris answered on the third ring, groggy but awake. He had been up writing a paper and was more than happy to join me. He said he'd be there in 10. The Volkswagen still hadn't moved. Minutes passed. The air inside my car felt thick, suffocating. I kept glancing at the car, expecting someone to step out. Nothing. Just tinted windows staring back at me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just some stoner killing time? A couple having an argument? Or was it something worse? Finally, Chris pulled in. Relief washed over me as I hopped out of my car. We started up the trail to the lookout, the night air crisp and cool. I glanced back one last time before the lot disappeared from view. The Volkswagen's doors were opening. 4 figures stepped out, moving in eerie unison. They didn't talk, didn't look around, just stood there. A cold wave of dread rolled over me. I nudged Chris. He followed my gaze, his expression darkening. "Dude, that's weird." "Yeah, they're probably just here to smoke," he muttered, trying to sound casual. "Maybe." We kept walking, picking up the pace slightly. By the time we reached the top, the breathtaking city view was enough to momentarily push my unease aside. We sat on the old stone barrier, eating and talking like we used to. For a moment, it felt normal, comfortable. Then we heard voices. 3 men were walking toward us, one of them passing a joint between his fingers. They were dressed casually, hoodies, jeans, sneakers, but something about them felt wrong. They weren't just here for the view. They were here for us. The guy in the lead, covered in tattoos, gave us a half smile. "Yo, you guys smoke?" Chris shook his head. "Nah, man, we're good." One of the other guys laughed. "Pfft, bunch of pussies." Chris scoffed but didn't respond. My nerves were on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about the Volkswagen. I blurted out before I could stop myself. "You guys were at the burger joint earlier, weren't you?" The smile vanished from Tattoo Guy's face. His friends exchanged quick glances. The air around us seemed to shift. Then slowly, he nodded. "Yeah. Why?" My mouth went dry. My pulse pounded in my ears. There had been 4 guys in that car. Only 3 stood in front of us. Chris must have realized it at the same time because he stiffened beside me. I could feel it, the primal urge to run clawing its way up my spine. Then Chris turned his head slightly, eyes widening in horror. "Dude," he whispered. I followed his gaze. The 4th guy was half hidden in the trees, just beyond the stone barrier, watching us, holding something. The second our eyes met, he started moving. Chris and I bolted. We sprinted down the path, the sound of footsteps pounding behind us. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. The parking lot came into view, and I fumbled for my keys, heart slamming against my ribs. Chris dove into his car. I barely had time to slam my door shut before peeling out of there. In my rearview mirror, I saw them running back to the Volkswagen. I didn't go home. Neither did Chris. We met on a random street and sat there, shaking, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Then Chris pulled up his phone. "I got a picture of them." The next day, we took the photo to the burger joint, showing it to a young employee. his face drained of color. "That guy," he whispered, pointing to Tattoo Guy. "He used to work here, got fired for stalking his ex. She had to get a restraining order." A sick feeling twisted my stomach. We asked if the police knew where he was. The employee shook his head. "Number he's been laying low, but if he's been showing up here again." Chris and I didn't stick around. We left, our nerves still frayed. I haven't been back to that burger joint or the Overlook since, and I don't think I ever will. I grew up in a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. Finding something to do on the weekends was always a challenge, which is why my friends and I got into the habit of sneaking into abandoned buildings for a thrill. It wasn't about vandalizing or causing trouble. We just liked the rush of exploring places, frozen in time, forgotten by the world. There was one spot in particular we always came back to, an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for years, yet for some reason, it had never been demolished. The building sat behind an 8-foot chain-link fence, its stained glass windows long shattered, its once pristine walls now cracked and overtaken by ivy. We had been there a few times before, but on this particular fall night, we decided to take things up a notch. We brought alcohol. There were 6 of us, me, Ryan, Jess, Mark, Danny, and Liv. The air had that crisp autumn bite to it as we scaled the fence, one by one, until we were all standing in the overgrown courtyard. The doors were long boarded up, so as usual we made our way in through a side window. Once inside, the first thing that always struck me was the floor, or rather the lack of one. At some point, the wooden planks had been ripped out, leaving only dirt beneath our feet and a gaping hole in the center that led to the basement. That was where we always ended up. The basement had 3 rooms, but only one had a door. The others were just open archways leading into darkness. We set up in the largest room, where broken chairs and old furniture were strewn about, evidence that we weren't the first to come here. The air was damp, thick with dust, and the walls bore strange markings, graffiti, old stains, and what looked like deep scratches in the wood. I shushed Ryan at least a dozen times because he was the type to get loud after a few drinks. But the rest of us weren't worried. Strength in numbers, right? Then, out of nowhere, a door slammed. The sound was deafening, shattering the low hum of our conversation. My stomach dropped. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. At first I thought maybe one of us had accidentally nudged it shut, but no one had been near the only door in the basement. Almost immediately, Jess, Mark, and Liv bolted. No hesitation, just pure survival instinct. That left me, Ryan, and Danny standing there, trying to steady our breathing. We weren't scared, not yet. We were just curious. We waited in silence for a few minutes, half expecting to hear footsteps or another sound, but nothing came. That's when we decided to investigate. The door that had slammed led into the smallest room in the basement. As we stepped inside, I noticed the first unsettling thing: a dresser covered in dust. The mirror attached to it was cracked, and across its surface were dark red smears. My first thought was old paint, but as I stepped closer, I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't completely dry. Whatever it was, it had been left there recently. Then I saw the photo. An old black and white picture sat on top of the dresser. It was of a woman in a wedding dress, smiling. But there was something about her eyes, something empty, hollow, almost sinister. My pulse quickened, and suddenly, standing in that room felt like a terrible mistake. A noise. It didn't come from the door this time. It came from the other room, the one we had just been in. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like something being dragged across the floor. Danny whispered, "We need to go. Now." No arguments. We turned and bolted out of that room. As we ran up the stairs, I dared one final glance back over my shoulder, and I swear I saw it. A silhouette standing in the open archway, watching us leave. My breath caught in my throat. But I didn't slow down. We scrambled back out through the window, over the fence, and onto the pavement, gasping for air. No one spoke for a long moment. What could we even say? Eventually, we just left. None of us wanted to linger, not after what we had seen. We never went back to that church together. As time passed, our little group drifted apart, and life moved on. But years later, when I found myself in town again, I couldn't resist driving past the old church. Only, it wasn't there anymore. The entire structure had been demolished, reduced to nothing but an empty lot. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if that place was truly haunted, or if it was just our minds playing tricks on us. All I know is that whatever was down in that basement, it wasn't alone.